assumptions that you get from, from reading what the next generation wrote, how they understood.
Next generations, including the generation after the first, again.
The Bible. It's not that their authority is greater than the authority of the apostles. Mm-hmm. It's their interpretation of what is written in the New Testament is better than ours.
No. Simply no. And by no, I mean not necessarily. Is the interpretation of the earliest fathers of scriptures historically important? Yes. Because the earliest fathers are, in a limited sense, so definitely not one for one, but in a limited sense, in the same cultural milieu and work from the same language, assuming that they're writing in Greek. So, and as time goes on, that becomes less and less the case, especially about the 4th century, which is basically a whole different world. But their most value comes in the fact that they're of the language, so they're more intimately acquired, intimately knowledgeable and acquainted with the language. So they can be very useful in, for example, lexical study, what certain words mean and all that stuff. So Clement of Rome, for example, is a relevant is a relevant witness in how we understand dikaio or I justify, and justification in general, because he uses that language in his letter, and he has a very significant section on justification, which I would argue a kind which Rome and Orthodoxy can't really take, given that they conflate justification and sanctification. So he's definitely a relevant witness in that, for example. They're relevant historical witnesses in, well, as we're doing right here, in the ecclesiology of the early church, and Clement in particular. We're talking literally, and since I forward an early date for Clement, so we're talking before the temple was destroyed, before 70 AD, which is freaking nuts. His witness is stupidly valuable, like the most valuable of all the apostolic fathers by far, in my opinion, alongside the Didache, although that dating is not as certain. And his witness as to the structure of the early church office, especially given the detail he has, is invaluable, absolutely invaluable. So that is a really important interpretive lens, in my opinion. Clement is a very important interpretive lens, but that doesn't mean their interpretation is greater than ours just by default, especially when you're talking about the fathers in general. Like no, it's not. Sober historical study goes with studying historical context, language, the text itself, its argument, authorial intent, all that stuff. And with that, we can come to very, very good and in-depth understandings of these ancient texts, like the New Testament, for example, to the point where we can be more or less on par, if not in a greater situation, greater stance, greater position to be able to interpret the New Testament text, given how we have quite literally so much stuff from across the ancient world, whereas they could only have access to so much material at a time. And from across time periods too, that we have access to, we are in a greater position than pretty much all the earliest fathers. Let's be real. We are in a better position than all the earliest fathers with respect to interpreting the New Testament, and definitely the Old Testament. They're simply not ancient Near Eastern scholars, let's put it that way. And they couldn't be, because like a lot of this stuff has only been discovered in the past century. So that claim, their interpretation is greater than ours, yeah, definitely not by necessity. And they definitely can't hold that up with Irenaeus. It's really ironic, because Irenaeus himself, book 2, chapter 22 of Against Heresies, he adamantly asserts that the apostles, that John, some other unnamed apostles, and those who heard them attested that Jesus, when he died, was around 50 years old. And this wasn't just a mere little brief historical tidbit, but this was actually quite a pillar in Irenaeus' own theology of salvation, of recapitulation, in that Jesus went through all the stages of human life in order to include all of humanity at all ages into his saving sacrifice. So that's actually quite a central pillar of his theology, and he impugns the Gnostics for asserting the view that Jesus died around 30. I mean, kind of a 180 today. And the fact that he makes direct appeal to apostolic tradition, and even gives what is to use Muslim terms, an Ishna chain. I got this from hearers who got this from John and other apostles. You would think that for Roman Catholics and Orthodox is like a done deal attestation of apostolic tradition. And the fact, because here's the thing, a lot of the thing, especially with Roman Catholics and Orthodox, they will sometimes make the more modest claim that tradition is simply an authoritative, interpretive lens of Scripture. Well, guess what? Irenaeus uses that historical fact to interpret the Gospel of John. When the Pharisees say to Jesus, you are not even 50 years old, and you say that you saw Abraham, and using his experience of common language, as well as this alleged tradition got received from John, he will say that they would not say this, the Pharisees would not say this to Jesus unless they believed that he was around 40. Like if he was only around 30 something, they'd say that you're not even 40 years old. But the fact that they say that you're not even 50 means that they believed he was 40. And in common parlance today, that actually kind of makes sense for us today, in my opinion, in my experience. I think I've even witnessed it. So he's got literally everything you want. And yet he believes something which clearly historically is false, even from the Gospels themselves. But also that, and I think there's indications in Irenaeus that, especially in the way of how boldly he makes his assertion, but then how modest the evidence from the Gospel of John actually is. I think we can get an idea of how there was an error. So we don't have to fret that, oh man, maybe the apostles asserted something that was wrong, and blah, 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 blah. Not beyond the realm of possibility. But I don't think we have to. I think we can find reasons for how Irenaeus simply misinterpreted what he received. Nonetheless, he's firing on all cylinders for interpretation, for a good apostolic interpretation, and yet Rome and Orthodoxy are forced to reject this one. They have to. It's literally the best one we got, and they have to reject it. Well, okay, one of the best will probably have to be gospel authorship itself. That's attested everywhere within less than 100 years. But apart from that, so they have to reject that. So here he is saying, oh, their interpretation is better than ours. Irenaeus gives an example of that with his access to tradition, but they have to reject it. So what gives? Us Protestants can look at Irenaeus and not have our entire faith collapse around us because the fathers aren't authorities in themselves. Their interpretations, at least. So, watch my recent two-part interview with Steve Nemish, where the fathers are partners with us in a dialogue. They can be wrong, and we can find that out for ourselves. The earliest ones have some degree of epistemic privilege, which gives them a little bit of advantage over us. But apart from that, not a huge time. John, good to see you, mate. The reason Rome achieved its reputation in the early church was because Rome was the capital of the empire. Yeah, that's it. And also because Peter and Paul were there. So that was considered like a double whammy of good tradition. But I hope you guys understand my point. This is simply not true. Their interpretation can be wrong. We can, and obviously with some more traditional Orthodox and Catholics might think it's arrogant for me to say this, but I'll just be blunt. Yeah, we can come up with much superior. We have come up with much superior interpretations of Scripture than many church fathers. Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Not that they're all wrong on something, on everything. Obviously not, because many church fathers give what I consider would be correct interpretations of Scripture, but they can be wrong, and we can find that out. So simple as that.